Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is Bucky inspired comprehensivity to understand and change the world. It's part of our series that we've been having going on all year. And tonight, Curt McNamara is back. Has been gracious enough to spend one night a month with us, covering various Bucky concepts. And tonight, you'll be discussing Bucky and systems. So go ahead. It's all yours.
All right. Thanks, guys. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, everybody see all right?
Yes.
All right. So as Joe said, we've been doing sort of different topics on this whole idea of, well, I would say most of the stuff I've done has been exploring comprehensive anticipatory design science. And so we had a session on each of those, and then we had a few other things, systems interconnection and stuff. And I recently realized that, going forward, it really makes sense to emphasize that sort of the entry point for many of the things that that we've learned from Bucky or can learn from him have to do with systems and the idea of systems. And then as I went through and put the material together, I was like, well, yeah. And then one of the key ideas that he advanced was, what he termed synergy. I mean, it wasn't his term, I shouldn't say that, but he took the term synergy, which at the time I think was more well-known in chemistry than anything. And he used it in a much more general sense. And that was the beginning of synergy being used everywhere, right? So that it's now almost overused, you might say. Excuse me. And I would assert that synergy and emergence are very closely related. So I'm going to start somewhere else. And so this is an interesting book. I bought it and I was like, oh my gosh, it's so dense. I can't really parse it or, figure it out what's in it. And then I read, I think, A Well-Educated Mind, where the author talked about a strategy. I don't think it was hers necessarily. I think it's a more general strategy that if you're reading a difficult text, and sometimes this is used with reference to what they call the great books, that what you should do is give yourself permission the first time through to not really get it all. Just say, yep, well, there's some stuff here and I'm going to gloss over it because I don't really get it. And then come back and read it a second time. And in fact, in that approach, you actually might read it a third time, at which point you're actually sort of taking some notes and solidifying your knowledge of it. So I took that approach well, so at least the first aspect of it. And I just read a little bit every morning because they say reading it in the morning is better, right, than trying to read something tough at night. And so then I got through most of it. Excuse me. And in it, one of the things that the author, Les Clifford Siskin, pointed out was that the idea of system as a way of organizing knowledge just popped up in the 18th century, in the 1700s. And that prior to it appearing, we used phrases more like histories. So here's a book title from the 18th century. And when it says a history of the earth and animated nature, it doesn't mean a time-based history. Back then, a history just meant all the stuff we know. And so in this particular book, he talks about different aspects of the earth and different aspects of animals. And so histories at the time weren't like a chronology of events. It was like, here's all the stuff we know. So somewhere now that changed when people said, well, okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff, in that history, but how can we think about it in a more organized way? And that's when that word system started to appear in book titles and article titles and et cetera. And here's a couple of key texts, I guess, from the time, and most of us are familiar with Isaac Newton, of course, in his laws of gravitation, and he termed that a treatise of the system of the world. And then on the right side is a similar one where they say, what is the system of geography? And what that means is, well, we're no longer just talking about, well, here's a continent, there's a continent, here's some islands, but, coming up with a more general way of describing them. So this is when it started to appear, the word system, in association with knowledge, the way we organize and think about knowledge. The author claims, I would say fairly convincingly, that this is what led to what we call the disciplines. So this is kind of what led to that specialization in a way, because as we did that and we divided things up, right, we made better boundaries. So the histories no longer covered everything, right? Like this history of the world, as you look at it, covered geology and animals and all kind of stuff. As we came up with more systems type approaches, all of a sudden, oh, well, then the animals are over here, right? Geology is over there. So this is a thing that happened at the time. Nowadays, system is so generalized that, what does it really mean? And so these were illustrations I've used in different teaching environments. And so on the upper right, you have the bicycle. Now, I think most people would agree the bicycle is a system. And you'd probably also agree the bicycle was formed of subsystems. And so it turns out that if you're, in a class where you're learning about description and thinking about system, you might start to write systems description of the bicycle and then descriptions of the subsystems of the bicycle. If you think about it, this is kind of a generalized system, right? Because you can have your wheel go out and you can go almost anywhere and get a wheel that fits. You can have your gears get mangled and you can go and, pretty easily find other gears that fit this thing. And of course, every piece of it that I just mentioned is created by a system. Well, multiple systems, right? There has to be a designer, there has to be a manufacturing facility. These are all systems, and they're using systems as well. Like the designer uses a system of information and knowledge, to basically manage decisions and ways to construct things and ways to document things. So he uses a very systematized approach. And obviously manufacturing is composed of many, many systems, how you get the raw materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the bicycle on the right is both an example of a system of subsystems that we can easily perceive, and it also represents an enormous amount of transactional systems, economic systems, manufacturing systems. And if you think about it, pretty much everything, if you look around, everything around you is designed, unless you happen to have a house plant or you're somewhere where you can actually look out the window because it's light enough. Everything is designed, which means it went kind of through a similar process. So it's kind of scary sometimes. On the lower left, you'll see actually a trike, right? And the trike is very handy because you look at it and you say, yep, you can carry a lot more stuff on a trike. And so now you can see that the bicycle as a physical system enables all sorts of other cultural and transactional systems. It enables trade, enables transport from one place to the next. My wife's grandfather, I think, was able to court and marry grandmother because he was able to borrow a bicycle and bike several miles away to the other small town. There was no other way to get there. So the bicycle, I think, is a great example of a system and how it enables many, many other systems. So then I wanted to pause, and I just wanted folks to think about systems and just describe one or two or three or something that comes to mind. So when I say organizational system, remember we talked about how we first had the histories of the world, which just were a whole collection of facts. And all of a sudden we organize those in a particular way, right? Like there's different types of plants and different types of animals. So organizational is just a way that we sort of lay out sometimes a hierarchy of knowledge, et cetera. Of course, then there's closed loop feedback systems. And, the the thermostat in your home, keeping the temperature constant is a classic example. There's living systems, and obviously we're all examples of that. And then, of course, there's ones like I referred to on the bicycle, cultural behavioral systems. So I'm just going to go away from sharing for a moment and have you guys tell me a little bit about a system of interest. There's no right or wrong answer. We're just starting to explore things.
So, folks, go ahead and just type exclamation point in the chat, or feel free to unmute and to share any ideas. I think that this is actually a really interesting question when we're talking about systems in general. Because I think of systems that are organic, and then some that are inorganic. And that is an important distinction to make, because how you'd reference Newton's laws, how the laws actually operate in those systems. There's a laws of nature, and there are laws within the systems themselves. So how we think about that, what would be an example would be something like Moore's law would be a law within a system. But you were talking more along the lines of laws within nature. So, and that's what I was really thinking about with Newton. I was thinking with Newton's laws. And so I was thinking that's why I meant when I said that you were talking about them. But yet you would put up organizational as well as living systems, and ones that are closed with feedback loops. Something that I think would be actually interesting to explore after people have made their comments is how subsystems develop. Because I think that's, sometimes they're by design, and sometimes they don't necessarily, they tend to self-organize due to inefficiencies. And I can actually provide, some really interesting examples along those lines. But let's actually go to Jeannie, then Paul.
Okay, well, I hope I'm not jumping ahead to something you're going to cover, but I was thinking of, how you can use natural systems to, kind of create another system. So say you wanted to move downhill, and there was a stream going by. So you jump in the stream, and the stream carries you downhill. So thereby you're using the natural system to create something that and I mean, it comes up a lot in other things too. Say, when you're trying to harness the tides for energy, something like that. You're taking a natural system that already exists and then just harnessing it to, feed into your own system of some kind of contrived thing.
Thank you, Jeannie. I think next up is either Paul or Maritza. I don't know who was first.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. What's that?
I was saying Maritza, go ahead, but no, okay, I'll go ahead. Okay. First of all, I keep looking at the wrong place because of where my external monitor is positioned. I apologize for that. Now I'm looking right at the green dot, but anyway, I think, Zoom brought us an important point in introducing the AI companion, because I think it would be huge for a guy like you, Curt, to, and you're probably already doing this, think of the AI as a component that extends our system in completely new ways in a million contexts. And what is its role, and how do we interact with it? And most importantly, maybe, where is the locus of control in the system? I mean, it's just perfect to start that discussion. So that's what I think of.
Thanks. Curt, do you have any immediate comments to that, or we'll come back to Paul's comments, because I think that they're very interesting.
I had a comment on Jeannie, but why don't we let Maritza?
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Maritza.
So what's been on my mind lately is systems of people or people as systems. And so I'm going to put that here on the table as a concept of, communities are a system, in their own right. There's the idea of a system being composed of interrelated and interdependent elements that work together to form a complex whole, right? And if we look at it from that angle, you do have to consider the human component. And I've been looking at it, specifically kind of at um, the intersection of, healthcare, and because healthcare is itself a giant system, but healthcare is a man-made system. And I've been looking at how do we view this man-made system with perpetually keeping in mind the very tangible fact that the natural system of human communities is kind of interwoven or has to be overlaid somehow. And so I just wanted to put that one out there.
Great. So yeah, back to genies. So what popped in my head was Eli Whitney. And I apologize if you guys all know this story, but he was on break from college and he went through the South and he saw at the time, basically African Americans, and I think they might have been supposedly free at the time, but picking cotton, it was a laborious process. It was terrible. So he got busy. He invented the cotton gin. There was no intellectual property protection, so it got copied like mad. He never made any money. So, but he continued on. He's a very inventive person. And then one of the wars came up, and the government needed more rifles at a lower cost than it seemed like could be made. And at the time, rifles were made in a very one-on-one process. So I would sit over here making barrels, and Paul would sit over there making stocks, and Jeannie would say, well, here's a barrel in the stock. Geez, they don't fit very well. So then, she might be filing. And so it was not a real controlled process. So I don't think that Eli was the first one, but he set up an operation alongside a stream in, I think, Connecticut. So there's a rotating water wheel, and then that turns different axles and gears, so that then down the whole length of this operation, there's basically a rotating shaft that's available to you that you can put a tool on. And then he basically said, well, Curt's just going to make barrels, but he's going to use this. And he sort of invented the idea of fixtures or jigs to hold stuff in place, so that then all of a sudden, guess what? All those barrels kind of started to look the same. And then the same with Paul. He was given the tools and the jigs so that the stocks more or less looked the same. The result was then Jeannie's job got much easier. You get rifles out a lot faster. He could actually make the contract, et cetera, and he actually wound up making a little money on this thing. So yes, and in some old papers, I kind of looked at that as an example of systems coupling, right? That if you drew a polyhedral system with flow along one edge, how you could couple to that flow. And of course, this is sort of a generalized principle. How many businesses or whatever, they're just like taking a little bit off of a flow, aren't they? And then Paul, what I thought about on your comment, was, of course, Bucky and McLuhan had this interesting relationship, and McLuhan called it media, the extensions of man, and Bucky felt that as we developed better instrumentation, our knowledge of universe increased. So actually the universe got bigger as we learned how to look, more closely or farther or whatever. And so, yeah, I think he would approve of AI in that sense as another extension, if you will. And yeah, Maritza more later, I think, on this, but we're not going to get into it. So there's this phrase systems thinking, and it more or less refers to the idea of what are called causal loops. And so a causal loop is, well, here's a behavior, something we can measure, and maybe we want more of it or less of it. We're well, then what increases it? You know, we look at what increases it, we look at what decreases it, and we often find there's things keeping it stuck, if you will. And so this is a way to look at what are called human activity systems, which are collections of people doing stuff. And the result, you can model it in software. It was called system dynamics. Jay Forrester developed the basic ideas way back in the 50s. And then later on, Danilo Meadows and others worked further with it, Peter Senge, and they said, well, actually, in these sort of situations, there's what we call system archetypes, which is when systems get stuck. So there's a limits to growth one where you want the system to get further, but it can't really go any further. And it turns out there are some ways to look at that and maybe fix it. And then there's oscillating behavior, you know, when you don't want it oscillating and a bunch of stuff like that. So the idea behind the whole approach is to sort of make a model with other people, you know, so several of us look and make a model and say, well, yeah, it might look like that. And then you go test something out. And you test it in the kind of ways Bucky described. Of course, they didn't refer to Bucky, he didn't refer to them, but, you know, by making changes in relations and other parts of the system, you can figure out, you know, by testing what will make it better. So yeah, these are great. These are all really distinct examples of systems. And the whole point of this, to me, is that, you know, if you start thinking, well, what many people say is if you just keep banging your head into something and you're like, this is really frustrating. Why is it this way? And you just spend all this time thinking about it like that, you won't get much result. But if you say, wait a minute, if I'm trying to do something and it's being resisted, that means there's another system over there, right? That other system is trying to keep something at a current state, if you will. And if you think of it systemically, then you might be able to say, okay, I see that behavior I don't like, and I can see now why it's being held in place. And now at least it gives you a better understanding of it. And in an optimistic view, you'd be like, oh, now I might actually be able to change it because I'm not looking just at the behavior itself, right? But what are the loops maybe that create it or maintain it? So this is a huge area. We're not going to get into tonight, but it's a huge area.
May I ask one question? Because I think that this is probably relevant, especially if we're talking about systems and Bucky in particular. How did the fact that he viewed the universe, and he looked at things at a cosmic level, that he viewed the universe as finite, impact the way he thought about systems? Because I think that that's important in the sense that he starts to think about the relationships within the systems as a way of making connections between leaky corners, you know, and having models in the system itself. But having this idea that the universe is finite actually has an implication in how he looks and analyzes the world as it is.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I don't have an immediate answer to it, but let's just proceed along and we will bump into something where we can, it'll be a little, let's see, is it going to come back where I want? Oh, it did. Okay, good. Okay, so then we're still back in history a little bit. And so another thing that happened, and so now, you know, we kind of jumped ahead with all our examples. That was because we wanted to kind of explore this space and start thinking about systems in general and seeing them all kind of places. So, but jumping back into history, then, you know, we can see that in our previous examples, the people who talk system were saying, well, here's a way to organize knowledge. Here's a way to think about stuff. Here's a way to make categories, right? The author I think I mentioned already felt that it really led to the creation of disciplines. But then in the early 20th century, J.C. Smuts basically invented or at least repurposed the word holism. And guess what? That bolded, highlighted, since the beginning, systems possess properties as wholes apart from the properties of their component parts. And this is synergy. This is emergence. So we're just doing a little bit more of that history. And I actually just learned this stuff researching for tonight's talk, because I'd always read that synergy more or less just came from chemistry, and that Bucky appropriated it to, basically explain the same thing that Smuts just said, right? That the whole has properties that you don't find from the parts. But it turns out there was actual social synergy talked about in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And interestingly enough, that second sentence on the right side underneath Lester Frank Ward, the social struggle as centrifugal, and social solidarity as centripetal. And doesn't this sound like tensegrity, right? Coupled tension and compression. So we could have an entire discussion on this, you guys, but I'm just going to note that synergy, and even synergy with respect to human systems, has more of a history than we might think. So then I always refer back to synergetics, and what did Bucky say in synergetics about synergy? Basically the same thing Smuts did, right? Behavior of the whole, unpredictable behavior of the parts. And once again, I think this is what we're calling emergence nowadays. And he has a few more details here. The third one just says, you can't look at one lump of matter, right, and predict gravitation. Gravitation only happens because there is this relation between two lumps of matter. And this whole idea of systems as being constructed of relations is, I think, fairly uniquely Bucky's and very, very powerful. So this is, I think, an example of synergy. This is 1 + 1 = 4. So you have the triangles and you take them apart. And then after you've taken them apart, you put them together, and there you have the tetrahedron. And he's gone further with this. And he said, and actually, you can look at those two triangles as basically different events. And this is that whole precession idea, right? Which is that, as opposed to physics, which says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, Bucky clarified that, nope, there's always some extra. There's always the resultant, energy and information, matter is neither created nor destroyed. So therefore, there's always a little extra. And so then he just taken these two things, which he says are separate events, and put them together to form a tetrahedron. This is really deep and complicated. I have spent some time trying to figure out how to map something where the corners or the nodes kind of make sense. And I think whenever somebody figures this out, it's going to be a big deal. So, but once again, this is an example, I think, of synergy. And I think of the power of Bucky's geometrical thinking and analysis that we've all gained from. Another example from synergetic, once again, is that he said, well, Plato said there's a triad of beauty, truth, and symmetry. Well, he said it's not a system because that's just three things, right? They form what I suppose could be a plane, but it's not a system because it doesn't have structure, right? It doesn't have an inside and an outside. So for him, systems have a boundary with an insideness and an outsideness. And he said, well, the self or the observer is the fourth part of it. And now you can see, wow, this really makes sense, because not only do you understand that the self is the one who perceives beauty, truth, and symmetry, you can see that each of the things that Plato talked about, symmetry, relates to the others as well, right? You can't really have symmetry without some elements of beauty and some elements of truth, and vice versa. So this is just saying, here's the basics of Bucky. He made reference in many, many places in synergetics to the fact that the simplest system is a tetrahedron. And for you to have a system, it had to have at least 4 nodes that were connected together in a way that enclosed space. And one of the interesting things I've been running into is that they now pretty much view water as a tetrahedral molecule. And this is just a screen grab from an image search on, water, H2O as a tetrahedron. There's many, many examples of it. And now going a level up, well, guess what? You get even more, right? And now you start to understand that water itself has all these emergent properties. So you have levels and levels of emergence in water. And once again, remembering emergence means if we look at one level, like quantum, we're not going to be able to predict, electrons, neutrons, and protons. Okay, if we just look at electrons, protons, and neutrons, we're not going to be able to come up with nanotube elements. I mean, you might eventually, figure out a combination, but I mean, it's not obvious. If we look at the various molecules, we're not going to say, oh yeah, and we get water, right? And if you look at a water molecule, You're not going to really understand the flow of water. You're not going to understand that when water freezes, it forms this form, the frozen form, which is lighter. So it floats on the surface of the ponds, making life possible. There's various kinds of flow that aren't predicted by the one below. So there's laminar flow and turbulent flow. And then in physics now, they actually recast this as 4 different emergent properties of water, including cohesion. So this is a great example if you want to talk to anybody about how emergence is all around us and you just don't see it. So then we've got the idea. Systems are a really important thing and a useful thing for us to know about and to think about. And so how do we find them? And this was, I think I mentioned earlier, text from different books that was found by Bard with the search on minimum 2. And I thought it was really interesting, and it kind of fits into the rest of Bucky's work on finding a system. So I've highlighted in the first one, 2 ways of experiencing anything. You can experience it as separate and isolated, or as part of a larger whole. In the second one, think in terms of division and separation, or to think in terms of unity and wholeness. Those are pretty similar, but a little different. And then finally, you can experience it as a single entity or as a collection of parts. And so this really gets in that whole idea of systems hang together, they have cohesion, and they're more than the sum. So another example of how to find a system is if you see a behavior. And of course, we're surrounded by behaviors, and I guess we're also surrounded by, and we use functions. So everything that you pick up that you've taken into your life, you've done it because it fulfills a function. So if I were to hold up my pencil, right, you can see that it's certainly got a function of I can make marks with it. Oh, what else? Well, if I pull off the cap, you can see there's an eraser. Oh, I can erase those things with it. Okay, that's another one. What else? Well, it's got a little clip for my shirt pocket. Oh, there's another function. It's got a little pattern etched into the bottom of it, making it easy to grab. There's another function. Oh, it's got some words on it to tell me the manufacturer as well as what the size of the lead is. There's another function. And so everything that we have in our life, we have because of a function, and often multiple functions. And this is what we call structure, behavior, function theory, or sometimes function, behavior, structure. And the point is that if you have a function, for example, the ability to draw marks, it's possible because of a behavior. Now, in this case, the behavior is a combination of things, right? It's me moving it, and then it's also, quote unquote, the behavior of the lead in the pencil, right, transferring itself to the surface. And that only happens, the behavior only happens because there's a structure. And what's the structure? Well, the structure is the pen itself, or the pencil, I should say, and the fact that it holds the lead in place for me. So if we find a function, or if we see a behavior, we know that there's a system structure lurking around there somewhere. So it's just another way to investigate. We mentioned this earlier, that we also have behaviors that maybe are not ideal. They call them system archetypes. And this is an illustration from Wikipedia of some of the basic ones. And what they've highlighted in red are things, they're called archetypes, like shifting the burden, right? So I basically, decide to fix a problem by doing something, but I actually create another problem for me, right? The pile of papers is too big. Oh, let me put it somewhere else, right? I didn't really solve the pile of paper problem, right? I've just got a bigger pile somewhere else. And of course, it goes much, much deeper in companies, et cetera. And then just a little bit on Bucky's tuning in. So this is the classic illustration, which, you can't read, but if you could, excuse me, you'd see that just outside the center, he's the middle of it, he's got this region where he says, this is what you're tuning into. It's the system of interest. And he says that has a particular size, and that means it has a particular frequency. And every system, he said, that we're looking for has things, larger systems that it's embedded in, and those larger systems are also slower. And so we can think about it by saying, well, what am I interested in? the work week, well, the work week is embedded in the work year or whatever. Maybe it's embedded in the seasons, etc. And then also what's within the thing that we're looking at, and maybe the work week is embedded within obviously smaller units of time, but also smaller units of activity, if you will. So this was sort of basic Bucky. He has a essay called Universal Requirements for a Dwelling Advantage, which is how we thought about housing. And this is a little clearer illustration. The double dashed line in the middle is the dwelling. So that's what we're looking at. What does the dwelling needs to basically provide a safe environment for what's inside it, which is the human. And it needs to protect from the things that are outside it, like the storms. So this is kind of basic Bucky in terms of using a visual of overlapping circles or embedded circles to find it. There are many other approaches to this. This is one that I developed for biomimicry, and it's a similar thing. It emphasizes a couple of things. One is that the super system, the bigger systems surround it, and it also emphasizes that every system that we're looking at, especially in biomimicry, has an adjacent system, and often it's the adjacent system that the interactions with it that are the real situation that we want to improve or take advantage of. So basically that's why this one was created. And here's an example where this is something, that I'm thinking of putting in the book, which is, you're thinking of putting a shed in your property. What are the things inside the shed, right? Like the tools and the workbench and the light. What are the adjacent systems? Well, how close is it to the house? Does the rain and the snow fall on the shed? Do you want to worry about it? Or the neighbors, is it close to the neighbor's fence? Are they concerned about it? And then, of course, what are the larger systems around it, right? The yard itself, the community, like, are there requirements for sheds, etc. And then this was pretty much inspired by a thing called the system operator or 9 windows from Trees or Theory of Inventive Problem Solving. And in this case, you have the system of interest here in the center, and above it, you show the super system, so what's around it, and below it, you show the subsystems, what's within it. The difference between the one I developed that I showed previously in Bucky's is that you have time fairly explicitly in here. So you also looked at time in the past. And so you would say, well, what was the design challenge in the past, and what did the super system look like in the past? And so it turns out, from the standpoint of Trees, you can often use this point of view to fix a problem. Like, you're having a problem sort of cutting a particular kind of metal right here. Well, could you treat the metal prior to the operation, right? Could you do something, or could you introduce something else, etc.? You can also look forward, and this often was useful for my students because they want to develop a brand new way of thinking and doing sustainability. So here, the system in the future is their perfect system. Well, for that to be implemented, there's got to be a new super system, right? The new super system has to be able, enable, encourage, and allow that to happen, basically. So this turns out to be a very simple but useful tool for looking at this sort of thing. So once again, these are just different ways of saying, aha, I have a system. What's the boundary, the border of it? And by knowing that, we have some idea then of what's outside of it and also what's inside of it. In Trees, you also use this as a way to find resources. So if you think about, the center of the situation here, and you've got a design challenge at work, oops, sorry, you might feel like you're stuck, but it may be the super system, right? Maybe the larger work environment has a resource to help you. Maybe there's another person, maybe there's different knowledge, maybe there's access to an external source of expertise or something. So often you can find the solution in these larger systems, or in some cases, you find the solution because of these subsystem components, and they can be combined in ways that changes the emergent properties. Okay. Another thing that came out of Bucky's ideas that the minimum system had, 4 corners or a tetrahedron, was that we often will see things shown on a piece of paper as sort of circular loops, as if we're expected to always go from one to the next. And there's a famous one called, what is it, plan, do, study, act, or something like that. OODA loop, I think it's called. And this one was similar. This was Peter Senge's loop of learning. And once again, he put it as a circular process, and I just put it on the nodes of a tetrahedron to illustrate that there's lots of ways of going from one part to the next. It shows this as sort of a system process, kind of a medium level system process with different ways to go through it. And then systems, like Bucky said, they're composed of relations, and those are the invisible things, right? We can't really, I mean, we can measure them, but we can't really see them. We don't know where they come from, and they couple together at the corners. And as Joseph was mentioning, the corners are leaky. This is a related idea. So on the left, we have the biomimicry process as a very linear one step to the next. So scoping, where you usually start, you're defining the context, like where are we working? And then you're identifying a function. What do we want to emulate? You know, we want to make something better. You know, we want to cut something better. And so that's our function. And then you start to look to nature. And so that's the linear, you know, sort of clockwise rotation. But when the Biomimicry Institute talked to actually people that did it, especially ones that were inspired by biology, it looked more like the right, where they started at one point and bounced all over. And as long as they hit all the points, they wound up, they wound up being successful because they hit all the points. And then I was kind of inspired just today by saying, oh, there's 8 components to the biomimicry process. I wonder what would happen if you map that as an octahedron. And of course, you'd have to add a couple connections in the middle, right, to make sure that all the nodes are connected. So I think this is a great exercise. And let's see. Well, I was going to say overall, when I began this talk, that I think we've fairly, as a society, we've moved fairly strongly to a relational view. An example would be that many moons ago, when my offspring were younger, we had a Girl Scout outing. And I asked the scouts to identify different kinds of trees, and they didn't do very well. But then we saw a falling log goes rotting and returning to the forest floor. And I said, what's happening? They knew that just like the back of their hand. Oh, that's a closed loop cycle. That's a life cycle. I know everything about decomposition, everything else. And like I said, this was 20 or maybe 30 years ago. So I think we really have to much more relational view of the world. And then, of course, the fundamental relations, as Bucky said, between two systems, you have a single point of contact in the lower right, where you can move freely. It's more like a gas. 2 points of contact on the upper right, and that looks more like a liquid or a metal. And then finally, if you have 3 or more points of contact, you actually wind up with the 2 subsystems bonding together. And then you've seen this sort of thing before when we talked about, you know, what does happen at the nodes or the corners. Or remember when I showed the tetrahedron coming apart as 2 events, it's that action, reaction, resultant. And this just shows that that's always that little extra something. Sometimes it's something that goes out of the system, and sometimes it comes in. And then just a different way to view, you know, the nodes. You could have 1 input, 2 outputs. And like I said, there's something that always escapes or comes into the system at that corner. And then this one, I just do a tetrahedron along it. So then what is a system? Bucky said everything kind of is a system. That universe is the combination of the metaphysical and the physical. The physical is permitted, if you will, the different arrangements of it, by the metaphysical, which are the generalized principles. There's only certain ways that, you know, the elements, you know, are structured. There's only certain ways that come together as molecules, etc. And even your thoughts are systems. And once again, you know, systems have insideness and outsideness, and they've got a boundary, and they're composed of relations and nodes. So these are the basics. You can find systems by looking at relations. You could be looking at flows and saying, well, wait a minute, you know, where does that flow come from? What is it doing with it? You could find a system by saying, oh, here's a boundary. I'm pushing against something, or it's pushing back at me. And then that will allow you to help find a system. And just thinking about the way they do it. And there you go. There's a bunch of references, and I'm going to stop sharing and see what comments people have on all this.
So folks, go ahead and feel free to unmute and comment. A lot of interesting concepts have actually been put on the table here, and I'm eager to hear what people have to share, what ideas they have based off of what Curt has put on the table. And now, Jeannie, I don't know if your hand is up from before, or is it up now? Okay. So you know, one of you know, it just there are so many different things in different ways I think that we can actually approach this. Uh, you know, just when we're talking about when you brought up the idea of function as being one of them, is that there's a system around that. So when you're starting to evaluate, how do you actually evaluate something to begin with? And you start to determine what's the function of something and how does it function with what's its role within a particular system. The part I think, and from a little bit more of a practical perspective, that I want to start on, maybe that would be interesting jumping point, would be your super system, your system, and your subsystem, and how that has elements of the past, present, and future within it. And you know, elements of time actually are critical when we're talking about measurement of any kind. So I look at it now, and we've talked a lot about sustainability, and Bucky talks obviously a lot about sustainability. So if you think about it, what in a super system needs to change in order to actually have an idea that maybe one of your students had come up with actually become uh, become real. I mean, in the sense that it's able to be I don't like the word commercialized, but that's the, you know, probably the best word to use. So I think of something like a lot of the maybe an example would be uh, like a lot of funding being provided for essentially sustainable technologies, and that these sustainable technologies were not necessarily feasible because of their price point under certain conditions uh, before. However, the subsidies then go ahead and make them feasible now, and they become cheaper over time, and then they become more efficient over time. So one example is, you know, that we could obviously use is, you know, you could take the example of Tesla. You know, it's something that was moved towards away from fossil fuels towards electric cars. You know, they had a very large initial investment, uh, also from not only the private sector but the public sector as well. And so what that did is that also changed the super system that was essentially kind of where you had laws, regulations, and the overall possibilities that existed were you know, essentially changed by the fact that the incentives had been changed in the super system. So then all you have this idea, which is an, you know, electric car, actually then becomes a reality in that. And that is something that happens. And over time, now we're talking about past, present, and future, is that what you can start to see, and we talked about laws within nature and laws within systems. One law that we've been talking about in the past is something called Wright's law, which is actually just a way of predicting the future costs of a particular product based on the learning curve. And so, and it's actually more accurate than Moore's law. So it kind of aligns with Bucky's ideas of ephemeralization and doing more with less. So with that, what you did is you started to see the price come down, you know, substantially, and it is continuing to come down with over time, because again, all based on the fact that the super system had changed. And so that's, I think, an interesting example of how meaningful practical changes can be made. And I think now we're also seeing that with certain subsidies that have been provided to incentivize new technologies along the lines of carbon capture or whatever it may be, that are giving innovators the ability to come up with new solutions, sustainable solutions, environmental solutions, based on the fact that the super system had changed. And so I really like that. And then you can start to see how things evolve over time, and how these costs come down over time, and how we become hopefully more efficient and energy efficient over time. And that's where I think that Bucky's ideas with ephemeralization in particular is actually a as a principle is interesting, because it's not looking at things in a linear fashion. So anyway, I mean, that's where I think would be an interesting starting point. However, we could go into a lot of different ways. I mean, from the metaphysical to the physical. We could talk about it in terms of even how to think about the world within, within objects and the connections between the objects themselves. And so I'll leave it open to any kind of comments or from there. We could also work into the idea of tuning in. What does it really mean to tune into a system? So I think that that's part of something that actually maps on nicely to the super system, the super system versus subsystem. In any case, if anybody has any comments, feel free to share, or I'll just probably keep running my mouth.
So this relates, I didn't find the exact one I wanted, excuse me. And so this is an example of the 3 horizons framework. And so you have this new system that you want to take off. That's H3. It's low at the left, and then it increases to the right. And then, but for that to happen, you need to replace, the sort of the behavior, if you will, or, this other older system, H1. And so then I've actually got a nice illustration where you put little Post-its along each one of these saying, well, here are the ways we can increase, this new system and the adoption and ways to do it. And then also then, well, how do we sort of midwife, if you will, the H1 to move it along? And so that's one example. I don't know if the screen share will automatically move over. No. So I got to do the next one, but hang on, I'll do the next one. They're related ideas. This one is more reminiscent of what we call the S curve. And so the S curve is something in innovation where it's very much a struggle at the beginning to get this thing started. And then you start to get, fairly good response to inputs in that middle section. And then finally, all of a sudden, you're getting very little improvement. And what happens in the real world is that means another innovation is coming along right behind it, right? That's going to transform it. And I think I've got one more, sort of the same basic idea. I'll be done here in a second, and we'll get to Paul. And then so here's somebody, Jesse Henshaw, talking about how she viewed what you did at different points as a way to enable this kind of a thing, this transformation, this new thing coming in to happen. And I have one more example I can give, but let's let Paul talk.
Yeah, Paul, it's all yours.
Yeah, these are great launching pads, as you both said. So where to go with it is the question. But you're also still looking. Are you still doing this as part of feedback on the book you're writing, Curt? Like you were those other? Is it like you're presenting a section tonight, or is that what this is about still?
More or less. What I decided was, well, a couple of things. One was, well, I found out about listen.notes. I don't know if you know what that, but it's a search engine for podcasts. And so you can go there and type in Bucky Fuller and see anybody who's been, talking about Bucky on podcasts. Well, guess what? It's that new, and I'm not even going to say anything bad or good about the new quote unquote biography, but I'm just saying, you know, he made a lot of splash with it, right? But that's primarily what you see. But if you look at the systems change, it's like, OMG, it's everywhere. Everybody's talking about it. And I'm like, well, you know what? In the book, I'm getting around to saying Bucky was all about systems change and system interconnection. So I'm like, well, I kind of need to reframe it, right? And maybe introduce more of the systems idea early on. So yes, Paul, in a way, this is sort of prototyping how to,
Yeah.
without making the book this ginormous thing, right? Get us far enough into systems that the reader is like, oh yeah, I kind of get the systems idea. So yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, I just wanted some more context, but when we first talked about similar concepts in the earlier Bucky meetups, I went immediately, probably because of where my main interests are, to this idea of human consciousness as a system. Because that's what I love. That's what I love thinking about, and that's what I love talking about. So I'm just bringing that back into this discussion, even though it's really not new. But as a for instance, I think of like many different ways. Like, let's take Freud, id, ego, superego. But then there was a split because he was so anti anything sort of spiritual, or so maybe there's, just like Bucky did with Plato, there's a self that is not id, ego, or superego. Boom, there's the tetrahedron, and it's adding the same point that Bucky added to the Platonic thing, because this adult that manages your life that Freud thought of as self is such a boring, limited version of self. So I'm just bringing that up as one example. There's in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's, you know, this idea of you have your thoughts, your feelings, and actions. But again, is there an observer of all that? Yes. And dialectical behavioral therapy gets into the idea of cultivating the observer, like the Buddhists. So, and then in terms of the maps of human consciousness, all the different versions of what we are systems, and then looking at the boundaries between them, how they overlap, what would the merger look like? I mean, it's hugely beautiful to think of all the ways you could use these concepts of geometry and the tetrahedron applied to human consciousness. So that's where I go with it. I want you to put it in your book. That's why I talk about it. Okay.
Okay, well, there you go. Yeah, I have a 92-year-old friend who was playing outside his dad's garage in Los Angeles, and the Demaxian car came down the street, and he was blown away. And he said, I saw the future. I tried to get everybody to look at it. They didn't believe it, you know. And so yet today, however many 85 years later, it's still with him. And so he's left me phone messages detailing the experience. He's written it up. He's like, Curt, you got to get this in the book. So I welcome this kind of thing. And your commentary reminded me of a book I used to have, probably still do, called Maps of the Mind, right? And where they look at different ways of thinking about it and looking at it. It's very intriguing. Yeah, and the other thing that was mentioned is Richard Ramsey, who is sometimes in these meetups, and I don't completely understand his work, but it's suicidology, which is, you know, prevention of suicide. And he said, well, the model that was just a 3-part model, right? Of basically, you know, the client and the counselor, and I forget the other one was incomplete. And he brought in this idea of a validator who would validate the experience of the client, basically. So it was not the counselor trying to get him to change it, but it was that other person just talking to him or her and just saying, oh yeah, you know, I see what you're going through, etc. And it's transformed the whole thing, I guess. The model is now the standard model in Canada and a number of other countries, and it's going, and they've been at it 40 years or something. So I think all these are very powerful, Paul. So yeah, I do agree.
And if you could figure out the consciousness problem for us, I would be personally very grateful, because like we have so many meetups on consciousness in general that yeah, it would be nice to answer that problem. But anyway, just a small ask. Jeannie.
Okay, well, now I've not only been booted from a meetup, but I had Joe like take my hand down when I had it raised. But
Only after I asked. After I asked.
yeah, but I was going like this. That meant I
Oh, I
wanted.
thought you really did want to go next. Oh,
I,
I didn't know that. I thought you, when you were saying, I said, is your hand up from last time? And you nodded your head. I took it down based on that.
oh, well, I
I
guess
apologize.
a nod can be misinterpreted. But
Yeah,
my hand up originally was over the idea of the function behavior physical model. And you had been talking about Bucky, and I wondered if he ever used those terms, the function and the behavior. I mean, I don't remember seeing that, but and why I had my hand raised initially was you had FB and then you had BP, but I eventually figured out that that's the relationship between the function and the behavior, and between the behavior and the physical, which I assume are two different systems. So, I mean, if you could clarify that more, and while I have the floor here, I want to ask Joe about, he was mentioning a law that he said was more, more,
accurate than Moore's law, Wright's law.
yeah, what law? Oh, it's Wright's law, as in
Yeah.
WRIGHT?
That's correct. I'll
Oh,
put it
okay.
in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And then
Thank you.
really quickly, could you restate, you're looking at the difference, the connection between the function and behavior, and what was the third component that you were looking at?
Physical.
Thank you.
It was
Yeah.
on Curt's slide. I mean, if you want to put that slide up again, Curt, it wouldn't hurt. I would like to have it a little bit more explained. And actually, Joe, if you could explain Wright's law a little bit, so I could get a clear note on what it is.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. And I wish I'd had a better illustration, Jeannie, but this one will do. And first of all, I don't know, I haven't actually researched what Bucky would have said about function and behavior, but this completely follows his way of thinking. And so at the bottom of this, you can see the structure, and you can see in the left circle, they've got just these, two relations, right? And so that only allows basically kind of like one behavior to come off of it. And if you go over to the right, all of a sudden you see that there's a transition in the structure to where you have more connections, okay? And then that allows different behaviors. And it's not as clear in this, but the idea would be that you could have different ways to express a function, or you maybe be able to express different functions. And often it's used in design and from a sort of a top down, which to say, well, if there's a function you want to accomplish, then that function is a result of a behavior. Okay, so you have to think about that behavior. And for some reason, I was thinking about cutting up vegetables. If the function is to, divide vegetables into sections as you're cooking, then the behavior, is the action of a knife. And then for that to happen, you have to have the actual structure of a knife. And of course, if you have different sorts of knife structures, like, serrated edges and stuff, that would allow slightly different functions or way to do it. So often it's viewed kind of from that perspective of the designer saying, oh yeah, if I have a function I want, I have to at least think about, the behavior that would produce it, and then realize that the behavior is a result, it was only allowed by, if you will, by the structure itself. So if a structure is too confined, it won't allow certain behaviors, right? If you think about a system that's trying to limit your access to it with a tight boundary, you just won't get the behaviors you want or need. And so then the only way to get there is essentially to change it, which I guess would be Bucky's creating a new model. So I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of the idea. And like I said, there are better examples. I could actually find you something better if you'd like. I'll give you another thing to look at, just because I brought it up while we were doing stuff. At least if I can find it, I will. Maybe it's one of those things where it's disappeared. Oh, there we go. Maybe. Okay, let's see if it comes up. So this is Net Logo, and I think you can see it. And actually, and you can download this. I think you can still play it or run it in a browser window. And this is the models library. And so I would use this as a tool to teach students about emergence and how simple behaviors at one level would lead to more complicated behavior at the top level. And so this is flocking. And can you see this guy now? Looks like maybe you can, right? Okay. I don't know if you could see the library, but I selected flocking and I told it to run. And oh, now it's unhappy. Oh, here it comes. So with all these models, they're super well documented. So there's different tabs at the top of the screen if you looked at it. And one is the interface, which is what we're looking at there. Info tells you here's what this thing is doing and why it's doing it. It's typically reference to one or more scientific papers. And then finally, there's the code. And you can go in and modify the code. So what they have is a certain number of interfaces here, affordances, I guess is the fancy term. And it allows you to do a setup. So you get a certain number of birds in this case. And then down here are different aspects to the bird's abilities. So here is how far they can see is vision. And here's how far they're going to be apart before they say, wait a minute, I want to be back together. So you can change all this stuff. And then when you're ready, you push go. And they just start moving around, you know, by like one, I guess this is an example of a cellular automata. They move around one cell at a time. You might have heard of the game of life. And as they do so, then they start to be subject to the rules that, you know, I sort of describe by looking at the controls over there in terms of, you know, to what extent can they see another bird and how far apart will they be? And so then you start to get this very interesting behavior. And in the models library, you've got honeybees making decisions about where to put a new hive, and you've got, you know, making honeycombs, you've got ants foraging, you have tons and tons of stuff. So if you're interested in how this higher level behavior arises from simple stuff, you can run this. And then, like I said, you could actually click on info. You can say, here they explain it, and you could actually change the code itself if you wanted to do something different. I would have students use it. The reason I brought it up is previous questions about, well, how do you get from one system to the next? And we'd say, well, you've got to have these users at some point adapt a new behavior, right? And probably that behavior does reflect to some extent how they relate to other people, right? And so then it starts to look like emergence of what we call the social insects. So go out and explore some of these models and tell us about an interesting one, and then explain how you're adapting a new sustainable behavior, you know, could be informed or inspired by what ants do, you know, by leaving a pheromone trail, for example, that's there for a while, but it fades away, but it gets reinforced, another ant goes over it, et cetera, et cetera. So little arm wavy, but students tended to like it, and you guys have fun with it too. Well, I think we're good, you guys. I don't know if there's anything else, but I think
I mean, yeah, I
hand.
can,
All right. Go
I
ahead.
can just briefly explain a little bit about, you know, what Wright's law actually says. It just basically talks about the relationship between the cumulative production of an item and the what is the time required to actually produce a particular unit. So basically, the law itself states that by each doubling, the average time required to produce goes down. I think in the percent somewhere in the like 20 to 30%. I forget the exact percentage, but it's somewhere in that range. So that so that you can start to predict the fact that once and it's called a learning curve effect, that you're actually, as you're producing the item, you're obviously becoming much more efficient in the production of it. Now, that being said, what does it really mean, and what something I've been looking closely into is how what does it mean to be a learning, you know, to learn. learning organization or even a system that's actually learning. So there are evaluation cycles that I'm looking at that determine essentially what is it that is constitutes a learning organization, or what does it, Theodore Wright, actually mean about learning, and to be those feedback loops, what does that actually entail in order to predict what the price is, or the time it takes to actually reduce or what the reduction in time is actually going to, how it's going to impact your bottom line. So there's another systems thinker that we've had here in the past that I've actually been working with a little bit on that. And I can put something in the chat that explains it a little bit better than I just did, but you get the basic idea, is that over a period of time, how essentially the price decreases of a product. And so not the best explanation, but it is a explanation. Paul.
I'm not on that subject, so are you done on that one, Joe?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple of things that I want to come back to, but let me just see if I'm going to connect that. No, go ahead.
Okay, back to your point about, you made a little joke about, well, find out what consciousness is in your spare time, but I wanted to actually respond to that in the sense of a question too, which is, that's a good example of some concepts of both form follows function and sort
Right,
of
yeah.
squishiness of the ambiguities, where what I'm trying to get at is, this won't be an exercise, this ongoing effort of humanity to define consciousness, that comes up with one statement: this is consciousness. We're going to go, we have suicidality. Our goal is reduce suicidality. Let's find the right model and look at all the interacting systems that relate to that. So there won't be one answer. That was my proposal. Wanted thoughts on that.
Yes, so one of the things about all the system stuff is to start looking at any complicated system, you got to have other points of view. So, you start making this messy model, right? With, I put some things down and Brian does some more and Katie does some other ones. And there's various words for it, rich pictures, etc. And it turns out that we all have different points of view and that we'll never completely agree on it. In a business sense, they say this, though, is the big advantage. If Joe and I are in a business and I believe the whole point of the business is this certain bottom line thing, and he believes it's to make sure there's a good work environment for the company, once we understand it, we at least know where the other is coming from later on, right? And it's not like I'm going to try and convince him, but I'll say, oh, you know what? He's saying that because, and so then therefore we can maybe find some commonality or overlap. So instead of us sort of banging our heads, we know more about the others. And there's a whole bunch of similar things. Serious Play of Lego, where you sit around with your workmates and make a little Lego model of the company and the business processes. I think it's the same thing. You're basically trying to get to a shared understanding, but you're mostly trying to learn about the other person. So, back to Paul. Yeah, I don't think there's like a bazillion models of consciousness, but I think there's more than a couple, right? And I mean, just think of the cultural stuff. If you read any anthropology, right, or now indigenous wisdom books, it's like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of different ways of thinking about stuff, right? Like, animacy of living, of plants and trees and etc. So, yeah.
It just to maybe add to that a little bit, is that it was interesting. I just literally had been in a discussion 2 days ago, where we were talking about this this attempt to actually come up with a unifying theory of everything, and how that is like, and for, and that can be an approach you take, and, as far as, thinking about these problems. But it appears that that's an exercise in futility, where it's more of it's, as you said, multiple options where you're piecing things together and actually making connections, would be one way of approaching it. The other actual way that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it is even thinking, we've talked a lot about boundaries and thinking about the limits of those systems, limits of systems, so that you start analyzing what are the boundaries. And one thing that actually I read at one point, that had come out of Gödel's theorem had been the fact that a whole new set of mathematics had developed, in the sense that people started to look at boundaries as opposed to actually looking for that complete system without any contradictions. So I think that that's actually a really interesting point, that where we're talking about consciousness, this idea that there'll be this one answer, for which I was hoping you would come up with, is probably unlikely to occur. But
So
anyway,
this is kind of a response to your grand theories. So I was for decades involved in what used to be called the Society for General Systems Research. It's now called
Right.
the International Society for System Sciences. And, back in the day, you'd come to the conference and I'd have my grand unified theory. This is the way it is, Joe. Paul would have his grand unified theory. No, Curtis, this one over here. And so the one that I thought made the most sense was basically, it came from what's called living systems theory by James Miller. And it was further developed by this Len Troncalli. And he said, really, when you think about it, life is just a whole bunch of processes. And so this is me mind mapping, all these processes that Troncalli came up with, because there was too many for me to understand. So, for example, system definition includes boundary and the super and subsystems, right, and whether it's closed or open, right? And structure includes hierarchy and networks and duality and things like that. So, I think this is very useful and probably as general as anything. I always wanted to do a little work to say, well, how could we chunk it down to, like the 5 to 7 things that, a designer could use, because that's complicated, if you will. So I think it's a great thing, as long as we don't believe like, oh yeah, I'm going to get the one, and Paul and Joe are going to agree with me.
Right.
It's just like, if we can all say, well, yeah, we kind of see what you're talking about, crazy man McNamara.
Yeah, right. Well said. Go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, another thing that I'll say to Paul to support his idea is, I'm reading McLuhan, The Laws of Media, and media also is a good example of systems. And he has all these examples of tetrads in there. And I was telling Shrikant, he should look at religion as a media, to be interesting. So, but when he has his tetrads, every now and then he puts in not one, but two. So you can start thinking of these things not in just one way, but, map it out in different ways and come up with some interesting, quite different, directions when you're doing that. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
I've got a couple more recent McLuhan books. So he's still pretty relevant. McLuhan for Managers is one. I can't think of the title of the other one, but yeah, I think there's a lot there. And of course, he and Bucky, right, had an interesting relationship, I guess, what I've heard. So
yeah, I actually think it's yeah, it is interesting to think about things from, we've talked about multiple perspectives, and we kind of do that here with this different systems thinkers with different approaches. Here at 52 Living Ideas, we have multiple people. Bucky has been a theme that we've been fortunate enough to have some of the great Bucky thinkers here. You know, we've talked a lot about Louis Sullivan, as well as George Ackroll or Russell Ackroll. I'm sorry. You know, is another one that we've actually talked about that in various Bucky meetings as well. So I think that this is having these different perspectives and how to even think about systems themselves is extremely beneficial. But Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, to keep expanding our minds about what is consciousness, and give another example. There's really interesting research, and that's why you get these best-selling books called The Body Keeps the Score, that these things that are actual, seem like they might be actual mind things, are in the body, like they're programmed circuits in the body. And so consciousness is at least much more than just the stuff up here. And I don't mean just, oh, you get a stomach ache and you notice it up here. I mean, the decisions are made at the body level. That's what the new research is kind of saying. So again, what is consciousness? Well, you better take that into account. And depending on where you're going, that might be very important, your goal in studying consciousness. In other studies of consciousness, it might be irrelevant. So it just illustrates the point.
So I don't know if I mentioned this one last time or not, Paul, but Planta Sapiens, have you seen that title? The authors are saying that plants are conscious. And so one of their primary references is some work that Darwin did, on vining plants. Like, how does that end of that vine figure out where to go and what to do, right? And he developed ways to map it, and there's continuing work on it. And there's a pretty good argument that there is a level of consciousness in a plant. So
I think that there's that gets into some of Bucky's, again, the idea of the metaphysical and the physical and how the two interact with one another. I mean, that's what's being spoken about there. And it's interesting how cognitive reframing is actually links to, I find, and I was actually talking to Jeannie about this recently, can have an impact on how you physically and actually act in the world. So that is a relationship that's actually, that is of great interest and aligns with, again, the way Bucky looks at things. One of the things that I think that would be also just worth mentioning, since we have a few more minutes, is that what actually Maritza had brought up with the health system and the idea of inside and outside is actually a very interesting concept. If you think about it in terms of thought about this in terms of health care. There's in certain cases prices are fixed in certain countries, and so that the amount that you're going to have to pay is set, and there's cost transparency, which is actually a good thing, because one of the things that's so problematic about the U.S. system is that it's really the costs associated with certain treatments are not necessarily always clear. But when you fix costs on the inside, it's that inside-outside relationship that actually you still have to balance. The outside could be external pressures like inflation. And so you have these these other outside forces that actually can have an impact on how the inside of a system is actually going to function. So that's that inside-outside relationship that's very tightly made when we think about it in terms of in a healthcare example. So that would be just one clear example of how thinking about things in not just within your own particular system, but also how you operate within the whole. And that's where sometimes these things can actually become very challenging as to really, when you're talking about, again, fixing prices, there's always going to be some trade-offs with it. But anyway, I thought that when we were talking about inside and outside, I thought and we've been talking about boundaries as well. That's a very important point to think about. And so, are there, any other? I mean, there.
Yeah, Maritza put a exclamation mark in
Oh,
chat.
go ahead, Maritza. Yeah.
No, it's just the the mention of the consciousness of, plants made me think that, in actuality, it's against the idea of the interconnectedness that we study with Bucky. You can see that in something like that. And I mean, trees in particular, there's so many studies now showing all the different levels of interconnectedness that exist in a forest, with trees specifically, but also with a lot of symbiosis with other fauna that reside in the forest. And it just, anytime I see any of these random, like, science stuff, it's the idea that speaks most loudly to me is the importance of that ephemeralization, right? The idea of, and that's one, and then the other of Bucky's is everything we touch touches something else. And and I think that that's a really important thing to remember in any systems, all these systems that, you mentioned, Curt, and that some others have brought up here today. It's like, it's so easy to forget by the time you get very, very much down the line that you're affecting this like tiny little cog, like even a bike, you may take the bell off because it's ruining your pretty line. If anybody who rides a bike knows you probably don't want to be riding your bike without a bell. And it seems like a very simple thing to take off, but if you go back down, there are dependency trees that exist in nature that um, cannot be screwed with, as it were, without consequences. And I don't think that that's a false statement in any system. And when we remember that we are systems, our lives are systems, it kind of gives one pause at the idea of wandering aimlessly through life or through anything, because we have to occasionally stop and ask ourselves, what dependency have I missed? Is there a potentially broken link somewhere that didn't even occur to me? And what do we do in a system where there are microscopic symbioses that we don't see? And I don't know if I have the answer to that, but just putting that out there.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a book called Weak Links by Zermley, something like CSZRMLEY. And so, the weak link, strong link theory, we're more familiar with from 6 degrees of separation, right? That, any 2 humans anywhere on the earth are divided by roughly 6 people, sometimes a few less, sometimes a few more, but it's not a huge number, and it clusters right around 6. And so then, the friend of the friend is the weak link, but it turns out that's maybe how you're going to get the job, right? Because they know of something that you don't know of, or your buddies don't know of. Well, so weak links are a phenomena found out through all living systems and everywhere. And Zermley does an excellent job, in my opinion, of going through that. And it turns out, like, so reactions inside of a cell, it's not like there's a beaker, right, where you're shaking things up and you're putting heat on it. It's diffusion and contact. And so it turns out that that's characterizable as weak links. And it goes on and on. It's sort of like everywhere and very powerful. And I think it's probably related to Jung's synchronicity, although I'm not quite clear on that. So anyway, yes, I agree. And the only thing I'll say is that when we start to do systems maps, it allows us to get away from what we call a system paralysis. So sometimes a student will go and say, but oh my God, everything's connected to everything else. I can't do anything because what if this happened? Well, the idea of the system map is you kind of then sort of sort out the most significant stuff and what you're going to try and test. And then you go on and do that test, tinkering, sometimes we call it, right? And then see what's what. And so then, so there's this advantage, disadvantage of systems, right? You can be overwhelmed, but then it also gives you the view and the lens to make the maps, with Jeannie or whoever, Brian, and say, well, yeah, let's try this first, kind of a thing. So it's a very good topic, Rita.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of hypotheses that, just actually talk about thinking about the whole and, essentially how we're related. Everything's related, including our environment that we live in, actually. Paul, you have your hand up.
Well, I didn't really, did I? But that's okay. I did have a thought. You read my mind. I was about to type it in chat, but I'm reminded of, I wouldn't have known this, and I think it must be historical, but maybe not, because I saw it in the Oppenheimer movie, that he consulted with Einstein because he wasn't sure if the nuclear reaction would stop. Did you guys hear that story? That essentially would be
Yeah, that it would keep going. Yeah, that was
planet. I mean, it's a perfect example of the interaction of systems and our interference and then the repercussions of it. But they couldn't really know without actually doing it, which is amazing. Of course, they calculated low probability, but it's just another good example of the interrelation of everything.
Yep. It just coming back to actually, and the reason, one of another reasons that I actually really appreciate these meetings so much, Curt. I mean, your time and doing this with us. One of the evaluation cycles that I've actually looked at in working with potentially how to apply rights law in a little bit more of a rigorous fashion and actually make its predictability a little bit I won't say more accurate, but actually at least easier to apply. So that is the biomimicry cycle that you had actually linked. That was a very interesting, and I'm familiar with biomimicry, but it actually maps onto the evolutionary cycle that I was actually looking at with working that within the context of rights law, and then how to predict that over a period of time leads to the reduction in time in production, or also the costs. So that was I very much appreciated that as well. And that was it. Yeah, that was one of those great links that we've had here tonight. Are there any other?
Thank you, guys.
Any other?
It's probably time for me to head on to the next phase of my evening, but it's as usual,
me too.
Enjoyable. So thank
Mine
you.
is breakfast. So,
Yeah.
that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I very much appreciate everybody's time this evening. Curt, thank you again. It really is nothing short of a privilege to be able to have you here each month. And I'm very glad that we were able to pull this off. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon, and if not, maybe even in one of the book club meetings. So I'll just make some really brief announcements for the upcoming week. Tomorrow night we have Poetry Mondays. Maritza will be leading that. Maritza, do you have a oh yes, it's what is it? Who's the
Tanaya Winder,
yeah.
she's an Indigenous poet, seen as this is an honor of Indigenous Peoples Month. Figured I would represent.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. And then what's the theme?
Culture.
Okay. And then and then obviously after that, the next evening we'll have reading the Analects. And this week, I do not know who will be on our Comprehensivist Wednesdays. I think that I forget who. I believe it's Phil, but I don't know what he'll be leading, what discussion he'll be leading. So that's our schedule for the next 3 evenings, and I very much appreciate everybody showing up. I think Kirk was right when we have these smaller groups sometimes that we actually end up having more fruitful discussions. And I had a lot of fun with this. Been thinking about systems and how to categorize things for the past few days. So it's nice to see this, how it works in the in the industrialized world. I hate to say that. Maybe that's not the best phrase, but that's the best one I can come up with right now. So everyone, have a great evening, and I will see everyone online soon.